Welcome to the Your Innovation Coach webinar. Today's topic is Innovation is a Team Sport, Part 1. So the previous sessions have focused mostly on processes, but I want to shift a little bit. While processes are extremely important, I want to come down to the level of the team because that's really where, in my way of looking at it, is where the rubber meets the road, so to speak. That's really how we execute the projects. I think there's a common myth, this romantic vision of a lone inventor in a shed by himself or herself leading to some kind of disruptive breakthrough, and I believe it's that, just a myth. It happens, but it's really a more rare occurrence. The real question for ongoing organizations, ongoing businesses, is how do you become a serial innovator, not just producing, your first product as a startup. So that's really what we're going to be talking about. Teams are really that key factor in producing values in every organization. It's very common. We are all very comfortable with teams and so forth, and so that's what we're going to talk about. There's some basic team math. I think this is pretty common. You take a group of people plus some performance objectives, and that basically qualifies as a team. And typically you think of this as 1 + 1 = 3. In other words, the sum of the parts are greater than the individual parts themselves. So that's what we're trying to leverage when we put a group of people together in order to share experiences, leverage each other's knowledge, and create something beyond what we can do by ourselves. But I think you can look at it one additional way, and that is if you take that same team, a group plus performance objectives, and now you have engaged members of that team plus a truly shared vision of what needs to be accomplished, then that is greater than just a team, and the math adds up, I think, even better. So that's an important thing to keep in mind, that while this is the baseline, what we think about in terms of team performance, really this is what we're after, to try to do this time in and time again with the teams that we create in our organization. Some people, when they think about teams, will say, yeah, but that's great, but really aren't we really out for ourselves? And it is true that we definitely look out for ourselves, and you have to motivate people on an individual level. But this quote is from this particular reference, and I think it's a good one. It says, "It's true that people are groupish. We love to join teams, clubs, leagues, and fraternities. We take on group identities and work shoulder to shoulder with strangers toward common goals so enthusiastically that it seems as if our minds were designed for teamwork. We are not saints, but we are sometimes good team players." I love that last statement. So the bottom line is that while we are individually oriented, and that's especially true in the United States, we're very we value very, very highly individual accomplishment, but that doesn't mean that teams, don't satisfy something really inherent in how we are made. And that's the question. How do you get a team to really feel this way in terms of that enthusiastic belonging to something bigger than yourself? And that's really what the next 3 webinars. This is part 1, and we'll come back in the next 2 months and look at additional topics associated with that. But that's really what this is all about. How do you create those environments in order to have a chance to develop a team like that? So over the next 3 months, 3 webinars, we're going to be talking about these topics. Today I want to introduce you to a useful mental model that will kind of set the stage for the discussions. And then I want to spend some time on culture and how that impacts team performance. And then today we'll finish up with some topics associated with team structure. And then in the following webinars, we'll deal with team dynamics and things that we can do to support teams. So let's look at our mental model for the webinar. This comes from this resource, so I've expanded it a little bit. And in particular, what I've done is taken the whole kind of mental model and sit it inside this grayish brown rectangle, which represents the management model and the culture. The management model is really the key aspects of how we run our business, and the culture is really a subset of that. So everything that we're going to talk about really sits within that environment of the management model and the culture. And then as you come in one layer, of course, you've got the project that starts here, it unfolds, it ends, and all that is sitting inside of this this conceptual model. In the green here, you know, the project obviously is influenced by the business plan, the strategies, procedures, processes, resources, really the management system. And then once you, and of course every project is influenced by that, but then once you come into the individual project, then you've got what's called what we call the team space. This really has to do with team processes and behaviors and team dynamics. And then once you go into individuals on that team, then we're really dealing with human factors influenced by individual diversity, and this is really what we call the personal space. So I want you to keep this in mind as we go through the next 3 webinars. Today we're going to focus very heavily on this aspect initially. So let's talk about that first, and that's the culture and the impact it has on team performance. So first off, let's think about what culture really means and how you would define it. And sometimes it's a very difficult thing to define, and so I like to use this chemistry analogy. On the left side is a crystalline structure, very ordered, very regular, very easy to describe. On the right-hand side is an amorphous structure. And an amorphous structure is defined here. It's not clearly defined or in shape or form. So synonyms are shapeless, formless, structureless, indeterminate, vague, ill-organized. I think that captures for me some of the issues with trying to put your finger on exactly what is culture within your organization. It's very difficult sometimes to define that. I think for me it's captured in this one statement, and that is you know, every employee has to think about that, and it basically influences how they behave in the organization. And basically this is how we do things here and what is expected of me. In essence, that captures what the culture is all about. It influences what we do every day in our organizations. It's all-encompassing, it permeates everything, and is why it's so important in the context of team dynamics. The other point that I would make is that you can't mix up culture with the formal mission statement. Formal mission statements have a lot of words on them, but typically when you really get down to the organization, to the individuals within the organization, how the culture actually works is typically different than what's in any kind of formal statement, and in many cases different than what senior management really believes is happening. You know, that's a problem in many organizations. The other point I would make is that culture is something that really has to be nurtured. It's not something that you put in place. It's not like a process and you know you can leave it and go to the next thing. This is a message really particularly for senior management. I think in the senior management level it's easy to get caught up in all other aspects of the management model. They're more you know, they're more easy to grasp. You know, the processes, making the numbers every quarter, those are the kind of things that senior management is very comfortable dealing with and spend a lot of time with that. The culture, not as much. And you know, I will ask senior management, how do they specifically foster the culture in their organization? Do they know what the culture is really about? Do they really understand it? And what does it mean to them? So it's a very important topic and something that can't be ignored. To illustrate this point in terms of how culture can affect teams, this slide shows a hypothetical team, and I'll set the stage for you here. This is a project team, and they've just run into some kind of a technical issue with their project. And as a result of that technical issue, they believe that they're going to have to delay the introduction of this product to market by, say, about 6 months. So the project leader who's standing up here has gone and talked to the CEO and laid out what the issues are and what they're planning on doing, but the fact that they don't believe that they can get this introduced to the market in shorter than 6 months. Well, the CEO, who might not really want to listen to bad news or listen to what's happening with these project teams, maybe they don't quite understand what happens within the technology that's being developed within their organization, basically looks at the project manager and says, no, you don't have 6 months. We got to get this out on time. You got to go back to the team, and you just got to figure it out. You guys got to work harder, whatever. No, we're not going to relent on any of the features. This is what we need to go to market. This is what you promised to do, and you just got to go back and figure out a way to do it. So that's where we are here today. The project leader has come back to the team in order to talk through the issues with the team. And there are a lot of things going through the minds of these team members, and I think you can put yourself in place of these and think about how what's happening in the organization, in the culture, is going to influence what you think during these kind of meetings. So for example, this project leader might be thinking, I don't believe this. I don't think we can do it. I don't think this is the right thing. But the CEO basically refuses to listen, and I really have no choice. So that's what she may be thinking. So while she's putting on a good face for the project team, there's a lot of things going on in the back of her mind in terms of, worrying about whether this team is going to be successful or not and what it's going to do to her career, for instance. This person might be thinking, yeah, here we go again. Her and her boss really don't want my honest opinion. Time after time I give it, but really no one listens to us. This person might be thinking, this is just amazing. This is the second or third project I've been involved in with this kind of issue, and every time, we're told we got to try to figure it out and just work harder, and I'm getting burned out, and we're just making the same mistake again and again and again. And this person might be thinking, the last time this happened, I went out on a limb, I took a risk, I promised, I said I was going to try to do something, and agreed to it, and no way I'm going to make that mistake again. So all these things are going on in the back of people's mind as this project unfolds. And that's the power of culture, or the dysfunction of culture, depending on whether the culture really supports the project teams or whether it's working against successful engagement on the project level. Of course, you might be thinking, oh, that's great, but really what does it mean to create a culture that's innovative? And well, I'm not going to go into, I could probably spend a whole webinar on this topic. I want to make 2 points. One is, particularly at the senior management level, to really think through your organization's purpose. There's a lot changing today in terms of the management model, and one of the things that's changing is how we view why we exist as an organization. Is it simply to make a profit, or are there other things that are just important? The people, and that includes the people within the company, and how they're treated, and how they're engaged, how they feel about the company, and the planet, environmental type issues. So a lot of companies are finding that this concept of the triple bottom line is actually really good. It makes a lot of sense financially, as well as a supportive work environment. And so that's one aspect of the culture, is thinking through why you exist. And this is especially important with trying to find ways to engage employees and get buy-in at the team level about something bigger than yourself. We talked about at the beginning about how teams can be very enthusiastic if they really buy in, and really what it takes is buying into a vision that's bigger than just your paycheck. And so that's the real goal here, is to try to find ways to connect with people and get them to view this shared vision that might go above just the actual project. It might go to the level of the actual organization and why it exists. So that's why it's important in the context of culture, and this is especially important with millennials that are flooding the marketplace. They are not as apt to buy into folks like myself, baby boomers, who rose up in organizations, based on financial performance, and that was the key thing in our companies. So millennials especially want to feel part of something bigger, and you can use that in order to try to leverage engagement at the team level. The second point is, I think there are 5 other really key aspects that are important when it comes to the culture. The first of which I've described here as openness. And that really means that employees are free to speak their mind and are not with fear of retribution, either from management or other employees. Senior management should not penalize bad news. If snide remarks are made or so forth to the project teams when they come to the senior management with bad news, then the next time they're not going to make that mistake. So employees are very smart. They see what's going on underneath the what really the senior management values. So openness is very important, and it permeates all through the organization. It has to be modeled by the senior management, but it basically influences how communication goes up and down the org chart, and just as importantly, across the functions. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. So openness is very important. Trust. Does senior management really trust employees? It really has to be genuine. You can't fake that type of trust. One good example is, do you trust employees with information on the financial performance? Do they all understand everything up and down the P&L? I think that's one aspect of trust. Another aspect is, when you do go with bad news, that people don't feel like they're going to be, ridiculed for that. So trust is very important, and again, it goes up and down the organization and affects the communication across functional groups as well. Handling failure. How is good failure delineated from bad failure? There is a difference. In project development, we have a lot of good failure. Project teams make their best efforts based on the information that they have at a particular time, but they fail a lot, particularly in more complex, higher risk type of projects. So unless you're just doing all very, very simple incremental type of projects, how you handle failure is going to be very important, because if people are penalized for good failure, then you're going to force the organization, I think, into more incremental, lower risk types of projects. So you have to be careful about that. Again, this is very important for senior management as well as project leaders. Integrity. It's got to emanate from the senior management, and it's got to be expected all up and down through the organization. Basically that, you do the right thing, or we do the right thing as employees, both in terms of how we interact with our colleagues as well as how we interact with customers and stakeholders. So it's very, very important. And then finally, accountability. Every person has to feel accountable up and down the organization chart, but also, probably more importantly, laterally across functional groups. If you can instill accountability in terms of employees, that you feel accountable to your counterpart in manufacturing, let's say if you're in engineering, that's very, very important, and will go a long way in solving a lot of problems within the organization. So anyway, these are 5 other key aspects. I think we could spend a lot of time on this, but I wanted to mention those, and maybe at some point we'll come back to that. So the benefit of all this is really what you're looking for is engagement. You want employees to, again, buy into something bigger than themselves, and you do that by creating this environment of thinking through the purpose of your organization. You do it through focusing on those 5 key aspects and getting that percolated through the organization and modeled by the senior management. It takes time to do that if it's not good now, and that gets back to what I was mentioning before about how you really need to to nurture that type of a culture. Another aspect of this is that the culture within the organization really can be viewed as competitive advantage. I love this quote from Peter Drucker, because it really says that you can have the best strategy, the best processes in the world, but if your culture is not supportive, then all of that is for naught. So, on the other hand, you can have a very, very strong culture, something that's very supportive for innovation in particular, and get by with suboptimum processes, and employees will forgive a lot of things if there's a really strong culture within the organization. I've certainly got some case studies. If you're interested in this topic, I can provide you some additional information. But the bottom line is, today, business models and your products, all of that kind of stuff can be easily copied by the competitors, but a unique culture cannot. And so I would, really make the case that culture can be viewed in that context. The bottom line for me is that, the whole point of this section was teams function within the context of the company's culture, and you can't ignore it. And management, of course, is responsible for the culture, but that doesn't mean employees can't influence it. So it's even if you're a content provider in an organization at the lowest levels of the organization, that doesn't mean that you can't influence how things work within the culture of the organization, just by how you treat other people. And then, of course, it's important for management to spend the time on this and think about this topic. Okay, so I started out with culture because I think sometimes it's ignored in the context of team performance. But I think hopefully my example with the hypothetical project team, you can make that connection that how our teams function is not in isolation from what's going on within the culture of the organization. Next, I want to turn my attention to some topics related to team structure. And to begin this topic, team structure is going to be influenced by the organization structure. So I just wanted to, talk about that a little bit. In my experience, product development organizations are basically organized in these three basic ways, either by function, by product, or by process. There are some other key considerations where the project manager is going to reside organizationally, and how are you going to support existing products and processes. So that all influences this as well. We talked about this at length in the resource allocation webinar about the time that folks in your teams have to spend on this kind of stuff. So it is important to think about. So as far as these three fundamental choices, you've got the classic functional organization where you've got functional groups, in this case, say mechanical, electrical, software, and then those types of resources report up through the functional manager. This is a really common structure that came out of universities in the 12th century, and then industrial organizations picked it up later. One of the problems is project management here, so this is where project management came in to cut across these functional groups in order to run projects. So this can be a more common structure in larger organizations. I don't see it as much in smaller and mid-sized, just because of the resource requirements, but it is something that you see in larger organizations. Another way is to organize by product. So here you got product A, product B, product C, and all the resources that are required in order to run projects within that project. And this product manager actually might be the project manager for projects for that product line. This is a pretty powerful, I think, organization structure. I think there's some big advantages to it, particularly in terms of time to market and focus. If there's a quote-unquote a downside, I don't necessarily think it is a downside, but these kind of organization structures tend to not be as loaded from a resource allocation standpoint. So rather than being 100% loaded, they may be only 70% loaded, which actually is a benefit for time to market. So it's a structure that will tend to give you a little bit more flexibility in terms of taking care of crises that come up. You just have a little more flexibility in the resource allocation. So that's more common in this type of organization. Of course, that runs counter to many senior management really like to see the organization 100% utilized. And again, I go back to the webinar that we had on resource allocation and the danger of doing that. So the disadvantage, if there is one, is efficiency in terms of use of resources, but the advantage is time to market and focus. And the final third one is a process-centric organization where you have research, you got development. Those are two really different types of things. If you're a big enough organization, this makes a lot of sense. Sometimes in smaller, mid-sized organizations, I have some experience where we attempted this, but ultimately these resources got sucked back into the project work, and we couldn't really focus on really research-related type of activities. This really gets back to the difference between product development and technology development. And if you can do it this way, there are some big advantages to it. Of course, these three that I just mentioned, you can also have a hybrid between them. These are just the three kind of basic type of formats, but of course, depending on the organization and the products and the technology and the resources that you've got and so forth, there's probably infinite variations on the theme that you can have. So with that in mind, now you can start thinking about the project structure or the project team structure, and there are really four different options. One is what's called autonomous. Autonomous is where the project leader has full control of all the resources, and they actually report to that project leader. So everybody that's required to get that product to market, from R&D, manufacturing, marketing, all report directly to this project leader, and they're typically a more senior manager, somebody that's got a lot of clout, political clout, so to speak, within the organization. As I mentioned, all the resources report directly to them, and that project leader is responsible for evaluating performance. In many cases, they're separated from the mainstream organization. So in that context, they're not as common in small to mid-sized firms, but that's typically how they might be used, to separate out from the main group because you're trying to do something really radical within the organization. That kind of team structure can react very quickly. It does have some disadvantages in terms of scope expansion, as well as once the project is done, trying to integrate those people back into normal projects can be difficult because they get used to the autonomy. This is by far the best structure for projects that have very high technology novelty and radical projects, or maybe brand new business models that you might be experimenting with or looking at. If you're trying to disrupt your existing business, this is probably the best team structure because you can really keep it focused and away from the line business, so to speak. So it is an option. And even in the case of a smaller to mid-sized company, you could do some aspect of this. And it's really important to keep that in mind if you're trying to introduce something really, really radical to the organization. This might be a choice as far as the team structure. The other type of, second type that I want to cover is what's called a heavyweight team. Here, the team members typically report to other functional managers, so they don't report directly to the product manager. The team is typically dedicated to the project 100% and co-located. So there's a lot of emphasis on, it's a big project. You got 100% utilized resources, and they all are physically located with one another. Project manager, again, is probably going to be pretty senior and will have a lot of influence over those working on this project, even though not everybody reports to him because of their seniority and their even their informal power within the organization. They can get a lot done. So it's a step down from an autonomous team, but still a pretty powerful project manager. Advantage here is you can get really good team spirit and close coordination because these folks are co-located and dedicated to the project, so it's it's a viable team structure in a lot of cases. Third is a lightweight team. Here you got typically a project manager, not maybe as senior as the other project managers in the previous two, so they may have less influence, might have less organizational influence, from based on their position within the company. They may have more senior people working on the project than they are. So this really requires a project manager to use a lot of informal power and influence the team. In some cases, some of the resources may work directly for that project leader, and they may have direct control over those folks, but in other cases not. And there may be a combination of full-time and part-time team members that may, change over the life of the project. Typically, the team is not necessarily co-located, and likely this is the most common structure in mid-size to smaller organizations. So you see this type of team structure a lot. I'd say it's probably 90% of my experience with project team structure. Final type is a functional team. It's very simple. There really is no formal project manager. All the team members work for functional managers, and basically you just hand it off from one functional group to the other. It's a lot less structured, and it's really only appropriate for very straightforward projects where time is not important, or things like engineering change orders and that type of thing might be. That's really how those types of things function. It's a functional team, not a formal team structure. And of course, as I mentioned in the organization section, these are the four kind of basic team structures, but you could have some nuances and aspects of each one of them in any particular project team. So it's something to think about in terms of how you structure the team, again in concert with how the product development organization is structured as well. A couple final points I want to make is this concept of T-shaped individuals, or what are called specialist generalists, Ts, as they're known. This is some work that was done at 3M. Of course, 3M is a big company, and they have a lot of projects going on. They looked at their successful projects to try to pull out things that made them successful. And one of the things that they found is those teams had individuals on them that they would consider these T-shaped personalities, or specialist generalists. These individuals, typically more senior in the organization, have a lot of breadth. So they have a lot of knowledge across the entire spectrum of the technology, of the products in that business. They are multifaceted, where they understand business. They are attuned to the financial aspects of how the business runs. Even if they're in product development, they are attuned to the manufacturing issues. They are cognizant of the marketing issues. So they have a wide breadth of knowledge, but a very deep knowledge in one particular area of their expertise. These are very key people because they are typically going to be your systems people. They can look at the system as a whole. So they're very important on more complex projects. They're going to be the folks that are probably going to be your system architects. They make good project managers, and especially for very complex teams, you need some of these types of individuals on your team in order to ask the right questions. If you recall back in the sessions on risk, we talked about that. Very complex developments require a lot of senior, you need to really rely on these kind of folks to make sure that you understand what's going on with complex development. Another point is, and we talked about the core team, it's a very important structure, and is very common for projects that are using some type of a lightweight team to use this core team concept to manage that interaction. In my experience, in most organizations, the project lead is an R&D person. They're responsible for the overall success, communicating to senior management, typically will provide the leadership to the engineering team, and then also lead what's called the core team. Core team will typically have members from each functional group. So course, the core team leader being the head of the R&D project team represents R&D, but then they've got a representative from manufacturing, from service, let's say, sales and marketing, maybe other groups depending on the type of business it is. And so that core team really is there to help coordinate activities across the functional groups. Of course, this becomes more important on bigger teams to have this core team. I'll also comment, if you recall back in the project management section where we talked about particularly the lean methodologies in terms of project management. Core team, I like to think of it as more of a strategic type of team. It's not going to meet every day. It's more for high-level strategic type stuff as the project unfolds. But you can use the lean methodologies and the daily stand-ups for the day-to-day task activities. So the core team is not meant to manage day-to-day tasks. It's really more of a strategic type team, in terms of running the project. And kind of to go along with that topic, this is just a hypothetical organization where you've got an engineering group here. In this case, it's organized by process. So here's development, research, CAD resources, software development folks, and then you've got the other functional groups, manufacturing, service, and then you've got the projects, and those are in in hash mark boxes because they're virtual, right? They come and they go. They start, they end. And the same thing here. You got an engineering project leader for project number 1. This is maybe an R&D person, so he might have some direct reports from his group, but maybe some indirect reports from some of the other groups. So they work for other managers, but he's got a couple that work for him. So this person's leading that engineering effort, that engineering project team, but they also function as the core team leader for that project. And so you got the R&D leader that's functioning as the core team as well as the project lead, and then you got a representative from manufacturing, service, sales, and marketing. That constitutes the core team and how things get done in the project. So the point I want to make here is that, and again, it gets back to culture. You've got the functional organization group, but what's really important for these teams is the communication and how people interact across the functional groups. And again, that all can be influenced by the culture within the organization. Do people feel accountable to their counterparts, or are there things working against them? So for instance, you can think about management systems. Let's say the manufacturing engineer that is part of this team is being rewarded on, let's say, inventory or maybe cost reduction projects or whatever. And the project leader over here is being incentivized by projects and how fast they get done and are they on time, et cetera, et cetera. So there may be a mismatch between these two functional groups in terms of how kind of the key people on this core team are being judged. And certainly I've seen that in organizations where, the incentive systems or reward systems are different, and that can drastically affect the core team functioning. On this other issue, in terms of communication across and up and down, there's a survey that was done in an HBR article, a Harvard Business Review article recently, where they interviewed hundreds of managers. 84% of those managers expressed confidence that they could rely on and trust the solid line reporting structure in their function. So up above them in terms of senior management as well as subordinates below them. There was a high degree of trust and that they could rely on those. But those same managers, 9% felt that they could rely on colleagues in the other functional groups. So that's a very important statistic and something that is hugely influenced by the culture. So we go back to the cultural type of issues, but again, I just want you to look at that in the context of the organization structure and the team structure. It all comes back to, culture influences many of these things that play out, once you get the team structure. Okay. So that's what I wanted to cover today in part 1. I introduced you to this useful mental model that we're going to use throughout the next two seminars. Today we really focused a lot on culture and how important it is and that you can't ignore it. Teams function within the context of the culture, and it has great influence on how teams work. And then we talked about team structure. The various options that you've got with team structure, of course, influenced by the organization, product development structure, and again, the importance of thinking about the team structure and how culture influences that. Okay, so I want to thank you for your attention today, and I look forward to the next webinar. Have a great day.